All right. Definitely so. So they have recovered from bronchitis. You said Pam has recovered, and now Gabrielle is at home with bronchitis. All right. We'll keep that in mind. If you would open up to Acts chapter 5, we're going to start down in verse 12. If you kind of remember the first 11 verses of Acts 5, really kind of this unfolding of whenever there's deception, whenever there is disingenuous hearts, realize God held them accountable with Ananias and Sapphira. And so each of them were given an opportunity to make a change, and neither one of them did. They weren't given a long opportunity, which should bring about a response from us to go, look, whenever spiritual things are not in order in our lives, it's not something to wait around on. It's something to deal with as soon as it comes to our attention. If you look down, it had a great effect in verse 11. It says, great fear came over the whole church and over all who heard of these things. Realize Jesus knows hearts, and he's not just looking at the things the way we look at them on the outside. Then verse 12 comes in. He says, at the hands of the apostles many signs and wonders were taking place among the people, and they were all with one accord in Solomon's portico. Notice, what are the apostles doing, just on a very general basis here? Signs and wonders. Do you see any distinguishing between signs and wonders? Or do we usually kind of see those terms as synonyms? Tell me what you think. Okay. Maybe something that's happened versus something that's going to happen. If you really stop and take a good look at it, signs are, you understand the outcome. You understand what changed. Maybe seeing someone like we saw back in Acts 3, here's someone who could not walk from the day of their birth. And then all of a sudden here he is leaping and jumping for joy and going up into the temple with Peter and John. You go, there's a sign. You understand the difference about here's a situation before couldn't walk. Now you do understand he can walk, and not only can he walk, he can leap. I mean, that's a big difference. Wonders kind of goes with exactly the way it would sound. It leaves you in terms of, there's an aspect of going, all right, I see that he could not walk all of his life, and now he can. I understand that part. Wonder is the other aspect of that where you go, I don't quite understand how. What is the power being used to go from never walking a day in your life to now not only can you walk, but you can jump and leap? And you go, there's the wonderment of it. It kind of has an aspect of where your imagination goes, but it's not imagination, it's reality. So whenever you see these terms get used, it's really easy to just go, okay, it was miraculous. But just appreciate what's really being communicated. There's an aspect of miracles that we go, okay, we understand what changed. But there's another aspect of it that we go, we don't understand how. But we understand by whose authority and power it happened. So, he says, in the hands of the apostles, many signs and wonders were taking place among the people, and they were all with one accord in Solomon's portico. I don't know if you remember looking at that picture we put up on the screen that had the picture of the temple in the days of Jesus, and that portico that kind of went all the way around. You realize they were meeting. I mean, and there weren't just a handful of them. And to go, here they were. Now, I want you to kind of make sure you always keep this in your head when you think about signs and miracles taking place. Look back, of course we're going to come back to Acts 5. Look at Mark chapter 16. I don't know about you, but I always like to kind of know the purpose behind things so much as we can. Mark chapter 16, look at verse 19. Of course, this is the very end of the Gospel of Mark. Verse 19, So then when the Lord Jesus had spoken to them, he was received up into heaven and sat down at the right hand of God. So Jesus ascends. Remember these same events which you read about in Acts chapter 1. He ascended, and where is he now? Sitting at the right hand of God. And the right hand is the hand of power. Jesus even talks about that. But look at verse 20. And they went out. Now who's the they? The apostles, specifically the 11. Remember, Judas is gone. They haven't yet come to add in Matthias. He says, they went out and preached everywhere, while the Lord worked with them and confirmed the word by the signs that followed. What was the purpose of miracles and the signs? To confirm the word. You know, a lot of times we think of miracles and we go, man, that would be amazing to see. But whenever you saw a miracle, here's the part of going, it's there to reinforce the teaching. Sometimes it seems we read through gospel accounts and Acts, and we read about miraculous things that happen, and we go, wow, that's amazing, which it does that. But sometimes we go, wow, it's amazing, and we don't perk up our ears to go, and what's the point of this? What was the point whenever Peter and John healed that lame man at the beautiful gate? Remember who they then told them about when people came rushing to them? That Jesus has authority. He says, this is the one who has authority to do this. He says, Jesus, the one that you disowned, the one that you crucified, he says, he's the one by whose power. So once again, teaching. Always pay attention. Anytime you read in Scripture about a miracle, specifically in the New Testament, go, oh, that's awesome. What's the point? Because there is one. If you look for it, you'll see it most of the time. Then, yes, Karen. Of Jonah? Right. Right. And whenever he brings this up, they're going around saying, we want to see a sign. Almost like, give us a show. Show us your power. And if you remember, Jesus' response was, you perverted an adulterous generation. He's like, I'm not here just to do miracles. That's not the point. The point is the teaching. And so then he brings up and he makes this statement, I'm not going to do any miracles for you. He says, the only miracle you're going to have is the sign of Jonah. And what's he talking about? His resurrection, right? 3 days in the tomb, then he's going to raise up, says, that'll be your sign. And if there's really only one, wouldn't that be it? I mean, raising from the dead after 3 days, would that be enough to go, I see the sign. I know you were dead and now you're alive, but how that happens, there's your wonderment. Who should we be looking to? We should be looking to God. So whenever you start to see it here, it says, they went out preaching and teaching, and you notice the Lord worked with them. Notice who's at hand. Here's the Lord. He says, and he confirmed the word by the signs that followed. And the word is the overall message. Don't think of just one English word. It was, here's the complete total message of Jesus. So come back over to Acts chapter 5. So when you start seeing miracles like that of going, okay, what's the teaching that's being confirmed? These miracles are not just for show or to get flashy attention. They were to have a teaching point. Now, notice verse 13. But none of the rest dared to associate with them. However, the people held them in high esteem. Now, kind of see this as a unique little coin, two sides. The people in general, even if they weren't followers of Jesus, how did they see what the apostles were doing? How did they hold them? High esteem. Now, what does that mean to you? respect, looked up to. Now, but then you get this other aspect of the verse and says what? But it says, none of the rest dared to associate with them. Now, this is kind of a unique little spectrum, and it doesn't give you the heart behind all this, but I don't want you to pigeonhole people all into the same thought here. Because I don't know if you've had people that you highly esteemed, that you thought highly of, you respected, but then you're like, well, I don't really want to be around them, though. Because sometimes we look at ourselves and go, I'm not really worthy to be with these kind of people. There could be other aspects of this spectrum of going, why do they do this? Of saying statements like, what's this going to cost me if I really follow Jesus? Am I going to get thrown out of the synagogue for the religious Jews? I won't be able to go back anymore. And so because of looking at the price, they kind of go, well, I'm not ready to go there yet. But man, I really do respect what they're doing. There may be other people who you kind of start looking down the spectrum even further, and they have statements that might be along the lines of, man, that's awesome what they're doing, but I'm not going to change. So whenever you see a statement like here in verse 13 where it says, but none of the rest dared to associate with them, however the people held them in high esteem, don't just look at that and go, well, they're just a bunch of arrogant people. You realize you're just dealing with humanity. It's not like all of them were thinking the exact same thing. But then notice what comes next. Verse 14. He says, and all the more believers in the Lord, multitudes of men and women were constantly added to their number. Did everybody stay unassociated? No. So notice, the gospel message was working in the hearts of men and women. And so there may have been some at first who said, well, I don't know about this. I don't know if the Lord really forgive me. There are people who's like, I don't want anything to do with that. But man, what they're doing is really respectful. And so you see him, and he says, all the more believers in the Lord. He says, multitudes. Now, typically in the gospel accounts, and you start seeing terms like multitudes, what kind of numbers are you dealing with? Thousands. Now, if you kind of notice, it says, multitudes of men and women were constantly added to their number. Notice it wasn't just spurts. Big number here, big number there, everyone. It says, there's just a constant adding. And who does the adding? God does. So, here are things as they kind of lay out. If you think back through the book of Acts so far, and Brent kind of shared this with me, so I want to share it with you. You start looking back, in Acts chapter 1, there's like 120 that are in the upper room, right? Acts chapter 2, after the apostles preached the gospel on Pentecost, now the number's up to 3,000 souls that had been saved, had received the word, been baptized into Christ. Now they have salvation. So you go 120 in chapter 1, 300 believers in chapter 2. Thank you. Thank you. I moved a decimal point. Appreciate that. 120 in chapter 1, 3,000 in chapter 2. And then whenever you get to chapter 4, if you remember it, just Acts chapter 4, verse 4, then you're up to 5,000. He says, many of those who had heard the message believed, and the number of, and this is just the men, that number's up to 5,000. Now, in chapter 2, and it's 3,000, it's men and women. Now you get over here to chapter 4, and you're up to 5,000 men and the women. So we're really dealing with numbers that are in terms of, this is thousands, thousands and thousands and thousands. So whenever you get over here to chapter 5, and he says, man, multitudes of men and women were constantly added to their number. I mean, this is getting pretty large pretty fast. Now, I want you to see kind of this total picture, and I want you to remember something that Jesus told his apostles. Now, hold here. Look back at John chapter 4. John chapter 4, look at verse 31. The context of the time is Jesus has been with the Samaritan woman at the well. And so they've been in the city getting food and bringing it back out. But look at verse 31. It says, meanwhile, the disciples were urging him, saying, Rabbi, eat. But he said to them, I have food to eat that you do not know about. So the disciples were saying to one another, no one brought him anything to eat, did he? Jesus said to them, my food is to do the will of him who sent me and to accomplish his work. That's kind of unique to think about, isn't it? How many times do we go, oh, we better eat before we work? Where's Jesus at in this? Look, my food is to do the work of God. That's where I find nourishment, in doing things his way, his will first. Then, verse 35. Do you not say there are yet 4 months, and then comes the harvest? Behold, I say to you, lift up your eyes and look on the fields, for they are white for harvest. Jesus is looking out, and keep in mind, he's in Samaria. So this is kind of a unique place to make a statement like this. He's not down in Jerusalem town where all the Jews are, or a lot of the Jews are. And so he looks out, and he says, just look around. He says, the fields are white with a harvest. Whenever I hear white, I think about being down in Alabama and seeing cotton all through the fields. Now, I don't know that he's talking about cotton, but just the idea, whenever the harvest is ready, because you can look out across the field and you can see all those little bowls of white cotton. Here he's saying, and keep in mind, he's talking to his 12. He says, don't you usually say there are 4 months and then comes the harvest? I mean, you planted, wait 4 months, harvest, typical. He says, behold, I say to you, lift up your eyes and look on the fields that they are white for harvest. Have you forgotten what we're doing here? I mean, keep in mind, Jesus is about to harvest a whole lot of people through this woman at the well. You're going to go back to the town, they're going to come out, they're going to believe not because of what the woman said, but because they hear and see Jesus themselves and listen to him. Anyway, verse 36. Already he who reaps is receiving wages and is gathering fruit for life eternal, so that he who sows and he who reaps may rejoice together. He says, look, the wages are already coming in. He says, do you not see that? Now, they're going to be a little put off like, oh, he's talking to a Samaritan woman. Don't you see that the fields are white? Now, he says, gathering fruit for life eternal, so that he who sows and he who reaps may rejoice together. Well, typically we think about those being the same people, don't we? Usually the people who plant it are also the ones who reap it, but a little different era here. Verse 37. For in this case, the saying is true. One sows and another reaps. Here's what we're really going after. Who's doing the sowing? Jesus is. Who's going to be doing the reaping? The disciples are. The 12, minus Judas, add Matthias, even Paul. Verse 38. I sent you to reap that for which you have not labored. Others have labored, and you have entered into their labor. Now, this is a statement he gives to them. I know this is John chapter 4. Whenever we're over here in Acts chapter 5, and you're seeing thousands upon thousands upon thousands, you see the fulfillment of what Jesus was telling them? It's not like because they were all going out and preaching in all these different villages and things, because everything they had taught had been right there in Jerusalem up to that point, right? In Acts 5. Who did all the sowing? Jesus did. And now they're getting to rejoice. You know, it says the sower and the reaper can rejoice together. Are they the reapers? Harvest of souls. And remember, Pentecost was the feast of the wheat harvest. Going, if they thought back on it, which, of course, they had through the Spirit of God, they could remember all the things that Jesus said and taught. So that's exactly what's going on. And they're getting to rejoice with Jesus in what's happening. And you think, here's what's going on. Now, I want you to think about this for a moment and make a good application. A lot of times you hear people use these verses. Sometimes even missionaries will come in and use these verses. Is it really the exact same thing? Really not, is it? I mean, do we have thousands of people in Jeff City who are really wanting to come? They're white for the harvest? No, not really. So be careful how we make application of these things and make sure we're not twisting and bending things. And I can understand when missionaries come in what they want to say, but at the same time going, it's not a direct idea. This is what the apostles came to fulfill and do. And did they do it? They did. Now, come back over to Acts chapter 5. Yes, Karen. If they're all being baptized into Christ. I'll tell you something that's unique. You got the Jordan River right there, so that's really handy. On the other hand, even around the temple, there were actually 66 different baptistries at the time. Now, they weren't used specifically up to that point for this. They were places to be ceremonially washed and cleansed. There were places where you could go and there was plenty of water to where you could be immersed. And so they were used in a ceremonial way before the time of Jesus. But then as soon as these things happen, look at what's already in place. God's already provided. Isn't it amazing how He can do that with very little effort? And you might think, well, 66, well, that means start doing some math. Oh, that works out not so hard, especially since you got the Jordan River pretty close too. So you see these numbers, they work out pretty good. Or easy, not good. Sure. It just moves on, because you think about 12 baptized 12 more, 24 baptized 24 more, 48. You realize it only takes I think I did the math one time, 6 generations to get, and generations I mean just individual, not lengths of 30 years. And to go, I remember crunching, and I'm going to be off, I'm going to tell you something wrong here. But it could all be done relatively within just an hour or two. That may blow our minds, but we can think about that, because it's not that everybody was baptized by one of the apostles. Because what precedent would that have set? That you would have to be baptized by an apostle to be saved. Is that ever brought out? Certainly not. So you can see a precedent being set, what's in place there. So when you start thinking here in verse 14, and all the more believers in the Lord, multitudes of men and women were constantly added to their number. Verse 15, to such an extent that they even carried the sick out into the streets and laid them on cots and pallets, so that when Peter came by, at least his shadow might fall on any one of them. Are people working off of faith? Now, it kind of makes maybe a little uneasy, well, they put a lot of faith in Peter. Remember who Peter was always pointing toward now. He's always pointing to Jesus. And you just imagine people lining out in the streets just hoping maybe Peter will walk down the street and his shadow will fall on me. Shadow. That's telling you something, isn't it? And to go, there's a lot of difference between the shadow of Peter and Jesus himself. And you go, he's really the one who's at work here. And you put it together and go, the sower and the reaper are rejoicing together. And you realize that's part of us. Whenever you see someone who does turn their life to Christ and to be baptized into Him, isn't there a rejoicing that happens? We didn't do the work. Jesus did all the work. We just get to be there for the harvest. Deborah. Right. And you, be those things, taking up the teachings of Jesus to be his shadow. And you go through it, and you realize even like with the centurion in Matthew chapter 8, the centurion didn't say, Jesus, can you just touch the hem of your garment? Can you just let your shadow fall on my servant? He says, just say the word and he'll be made well. And I mean, if you do the layout, it's like 25 miles away. Nothing like having authority to go. I don't even have to be there. Just say the word, and that's plenty. I saw a hand. Judy. You think in terms of, well, go ahead and read 16. He says, also, in addition to this, also the people from the cities in the vicinity of Jerusalem. Now keep in mind, all the apostles are staying right there in Jerusalem for now. He says, those are in the vicinity. Maybe you think of towns like Bethany, plenty of others. Were coming together, bringing people who were sick or afflicted with unclean spirits, and they were all being healed. And you realize all these things going together. Here's the response out of faith toward Jesus. Now, if their faith was just toward Peter, what's going to happen? Nothing. Because that kind of faith is going to take you nowhere. You got to come to the Lord if you want power. Now, here in going through, you see what's at hand. God willing, Jesus willing to interact with people who are going to show faith toward him. Sometimes you look at people's faith and you go, boy, I would have never imagined. Even Jesus with that centurion, you remember he's got a bunch of Jews who had just been listening to the Sermon on the Mount, and he turns to them and he says about this centurion, he says, I haven't found such great faith. He says he marveled at the centurion's faith. He says, I haven't found such great faith in all of Israel. Well, if you were of Israel and you were following, that's kind of a, But is he right? He is. And to go, ooh, this is a big contrast. And you go, and notice, Jesus encounters the centurion where his faith is. Now don't take that to a fleshly, physical direction, but go, look, here's where God is looking to interact with us in his Son. Go, what do you trust his Son to do? He says, do you really think he can make a terrible situation turn out in a beautiful way? Do you trust that he can do that? Do you trust that he can find comfort in the midst of affliction and persecution? Now, you see these things coming together, and then notice, Deborah. Right. Right. What's going on here is definitely physical. And if you look at verse 14, he says, and all the more believers in the Lord, multitudes of men and women were constantly added to their number. And you know about being added is about being baptized into Christ from chapter 2. Then you get to 15. Well, people are looking at all these things that are going on and going, oh, I want to be healed. And sure enough, they even got to the point where we can just sit out in the street and have Peter's shadow cast on us. We'll be physically taken care of. What is the benefit of being physically healed if you're still spiritually dead? That's what we would hope. But what's the benefit? There's not a benefit to just a physical aid, is there? The real aid comes in the spiritual side. Now, here's the power of Jesus and what's going on here. And you look at this, and then 16, he says, it even had an effect on the area, not just in Jerusalem. Now he talks about people coming in from the vicinity to come in. They're looking to be healed from unclean spirits, and of course, who had the authority to do that? The apostles did. And once again, what are the apostles about teaching? Christ and Him crucified. Karen. Only one shows gratitude. Out of the 10 lepers that come, right. And you realize the physical side, even though, and Karen brings up a story about the 10 lepers who are healed, only one comes to show gratitude and thanks. And by the way, he's a Samaritan, which is like out of all the people. And yet to go, the physical brings no spiritual benefit whenever there's no gratitude working toward God. That's laid out in what's there. I mean, we don't know what happens beyond. Right. Right. And you think about, Karen's looking at a broad view of what happens to me, will it have an effect on other people? Oh, sure. But to go, what about for me individually? If I'm physically healed, does it change anything about me spiritually? No, not until I do what? Respond out of faith to Jesus and His Word and His teachings. And you go, with the Samaritan woman in John 4, she actually, like, he told me everything that I ever did. And she goes back and she leaves her water pot. Like the whole reason she came out there. She doesn't care about water anymore. She goes back into town, tells the people, and they come out and notice they want to hear it from Jesus. And that's their end response is, we don't believe because you told us anymore. We believe because we came out and saw Jesus ourselves. That's where you find the benefit. The seeking, the going after Jesus with everything you have. Now, here's the physical side. He takes care of those things. But to go, it's not really until you come. You see the physical side, it's not till the spiritual faith shows up. You go, I want Jesus. Because there's that desire. Because that's something that carries you through. Remember about Jesus' Sermon on the Mount? It says, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. They shall be filled. What about those people who had a hunger and a thirst for miracles? You wicked and adulterous generation. How long do I have to tolerate you? Completely different, isn't it? See the difference between the physical seeking and the spiritual seeking? Sometimes people just look for the physical side, and guess what they get in the end? No benefit. Now, look at how he continues here into verse 17. So you almost feel like in verses 12 through 16, you kind of see the atmosphere that they're in Jerusalem. Like souls are coming to Jesus, multitudes are there, although some of the people probably from Acts chapter 2, remember they were there from every nation under heaven. So a lot of them leave after that. But then you get to these numbers in chapter 4, about 5,000 men, and realize there's a lot of people staying in Jerusalem too. So here you get to verse 17, and now he's going to turn it. Oh, Carey. Right. There's your signs and wonders. The wonder says, how is this happening? Who should I be listening to? That should take them straight to who? Straight to Jesus. So here in 17, not everybody's happy about what's going on in Jerusalem. But the high priest rose up, remember his name's Caiaphas, along with all his associates, that is the sect of the Sadducees. Sadducees don't believe in resurrection, spirits, angels. Well, the life of Christ really flies in the face of that, especially a resurrection, right? And sending a Holy Spirit, and angels announcing his resurrection as well. So, they have a hard time with Jesus to begin with. He says, and they were filled with jealousy. How do they feel about all these things? It takes attention away from them. They don't like it. They're jealous. Like, he's stealing our spotlight. Huh. Maybe it's because you haven't listened to the Lord in a long time. Now, and by the way, you see that, we're not going to go too far into this. See the term Sadducees? I know it starts with the S. Do you know the Sadducees? They're kind of a long line descendant of priests. You might not be able to see the Old Testament name Zadok, Z-A-D-O-K. He was the high priest in the days of Solomon when the temple was built. Of that lineage and line, the people who were followers became later on known as Sadducees, Zadok. But of course, later on it turns into Sadducees. So you're always going to see the high priest be associated with the Sadducees once you get to the first century. So just know that that comes with a history, and not all of it's bad. But then whenever it gets close to the times of Jesus, it turns really bad. So just want you to know a little origin there. Then verse 18, he says, they laid hands on the apostles, plural, and put them in a public jail. But during the night, an angel of the Lord, isn't that kind of funny? Here's a bunch of Sadducees that don't believe in resurrection or spirits or angels. And who does God use? But during the night, an angel of the Lord opened the gates of the prison, and taking them out, he said, go stand and speak to the people in the temple, the whole message of this life. Upon hearing this, they entered into the temple about daybreak and began to teach. Now, a couple things going on here. Number one, angel of the Lord tells them, all right, I'm going to get you out of here. And sure enough, they get out, and apparently nobody knows it. We'll see that as it unfolds. But also, what does this angel tell them to do? He says, go stand and speak to the people in the temple the whole message of this life. And he's not talking about this life, earthly experience. Who's he talking about? Jesus is the life. Even Jesus said, I am the word of life. I am the life. He says, go and stand and speak to the people in the temple the whole message of this life. Now for them, why were they in prison to start with? Because they were preaching and teaching Jesus. They've already been before the Sanhedrin one time, if you remember back in Acts chapter 4. And so here they are, and I think everybody would like to get out of prison, but then typically you don't go run back and do the very thing that got you there, right? So here they are, and I want you to remember the prayer that they offered whenever Peter and John got out of prison the first time. If you look back at chapter 4, if you look at verses 29 and 30, this is not the whole prayer, but the last part of it. Acts 4, 29 and 30. And now, Lord, take note of their threats and grant that your bondservants may speak your word with all confidence. They say, Lord, will you grant that to us? So we could have all confidence. Verse 30, while you extend your hand to heal, and signs and wonders take place through the name of your holy servant Jesus. So all these signs and wonders point specifically to who? This is what they had prayed for. Isn't that something? It's one thing to have events happen. It's another thing to have events happen after you have specifically prayed about it. And would you give us all confidence to speak the word about Jesus? Would you do it by even allowing these wonders and signs to take place? Have the wonders and signs taken place? Yes, they certainly have. So now it's time to go, okay, you remember what your prayer was about? You wanted boldness? And of course, right after here, there's a big earthquake. They're all filled with the Holy Spirit. And you go, now you get to chapter 5. They've just been brought out of prison by the angel of the Lord. And his lone instruction in verse 20, go stand, speak to the people in the temple, the whole message of this life. Verse 21. How do you expect they're going to respond? They're going to go do it. They've prayed about it. They've seen the Lord respond to fulfill their prayer. And now these things have taken place. And now this angel says, go stand. Preach to them all the life. Go to the temple. So then, verse 21, upon hearing this, they entered into the temple about daybreak and began to teach. How long did they wait? As soon as the doors were open, they were there. They didn't sit around and wait and go, well, maybe we should wait till the morning offering, about 9 o'clock. Nope. As soon as the sun starts to rise. That's daybreak, right? He says, and began to teach. It says, as verse 21 continues, now when the high priest and his associates, that's the Sadducees, came, they called the council together, Sanhedrin council, all Jews on the Sanhedrin. He says, even all the senate of the sons of Israel, even those who were associated with the Sanhedrin, and those who were in there, part of those senators, he says, and sent orders to the prison house for them to be brought. Now, the apostles, 12 of them, are there in the temple. They're all preaching and teaching Jesus beginning at daybreak. Unbeknownst to the high priest and his associates and the senators and the council, they're starting to make their own plans, and their big conclusion is, we'll go get these apostles out of the prison, and then we'll have our conversation. Well, let's see what happens. Verse 22. But the officers who came did not find them in the prison, and they returned and reported back. We didn't find them. Like, did somebody move them and we just don't know it? Is this unbeknownst to the leaders of the Jews? What God is doing? Do they not understand what God? No, they don't even know. Verse 23. Saying, we found the prison house locked quite securely and the guards standing at the doors, but when we had opened up, we found no one inside. How did it look on the outside? All secure. Everything was locked up tight. The guards are still standing there. Everything looked like it was in perfect order. And then they opened the doors and they certainly don't want to see this as a miracle. but you notice what God is putting in front of them to deal with. Here's another little added detail just to kind of take note of. He says, we found the prison house locked quite securely. Even after the apostles left, guess what? It was locked back up. Isn't that something? God didn't deliver these 12 men, apostles, through the angel and go, okay, make sure and leave everything open. He says, no, just take your time. Lock it back, and then we'll move on. Well, it's not so much that they wouldn't see him, it's that God hid it. from their eyes. It's not like that would, just close your eyes and not see. So, right. They were right there through the guard. And you realize, here's the protection. And maybe we should take that to heart a little bit more. You ever think about how well we're protected in Christ? And it doesn't mean that we don't go through difficulties and don't suffer at times. But to see the protection that goes, you know what, we'll deliver you out of here. Don't worry, we'll lock everything back up before we go. We'll go right past the guards. Maybe they're asleep. I don't know. There's other stories that will deal with that further in Acts. And just walk right through the midst of a difficulty unscathed. I don't know about you, but that sounds pretty awesome. Now notice what's going on here. So, here they come. It says, we found no one inside. There wasn't anybody inside of there. Verse 24. And when the captain of the temple guard and the chief priests heard these words, they were greatly perplexed about them as to what would come of this. Are they wondering? Oh, you mean these things are wonders? They're perplexed? Like, I don't want to get this into too much experience. But when's the last time you go, everything doesn't line up? Like, I left this box here for somebody to pick up. They came back. It was secure. No, they came back to get it. It wasn't there. Like, what's going on here? There's another story. But for them, notice, God's content to have them be perplexed. Because they need to do some thinking. Because these are the chief guards. These are the ones who are in charge of security. Nothing like feeling like you completely botched your job. Now, here too, God gives them shame. Or if you have one job to do and you fail, sure needs to make you wonder. Now, he continues, verse 25. But someone came and reported to them. Don't you like it? Just someone, just somebody, random person. But someone came and reported to them, the men whom you put in prison are standing in the temple and teaching the people. I don't know, you may not understand this, but I know where they are, even if you don't. He says, have you thought about looking in the temple? Because that's where they are. And notice the report. What are they doing? They're teaching. He says, they're teaching the people. Verse 26. Then the captain went along with the officers and proceeded to bring them back without violence. They were afraid of the people that they might be stoned. What does this tell you? He kind of gave us the detail early on, back in verse 13. He says, none of the rest dared to associate with him. However, the people held them in high esteem. How high esteem do they hold them? It was to the point where here you are, the temple guard, coming in to arrest men who you just were in prison the day before and are out now for some reason unbeknownst to them and going, whatever we do, boys, don't turn this into violence because they will eat us alive. They will utterly destroy us. Which tells you the way, even the security guards, how they looked at the situation. I mean, they looked around and said, we're far outnumbered. Don't be a fool. So he gets to this point, and they make this statement. He says, man, they're afraid of the people. Now, the high priest and his associates, they're filled with jealousy. The people hold these saints in high esteem, even though they might want to hold them at a distance. And now there's multitudes of them, thousands in the portico of Solomon, all around that kind of that edge of the temple. Then, verse 27, when they had brought them, they stood them before the council. The high priest questioned them, saying, we gave you strict orders not to continue teaching in this name, and yet you have filled Jerusalem with your teaching and intend to bring this man's blood upon us. You remember, chapter 4, that's exactly what they told Peter and John. You remember John's response, or their response? You decide. Should we listen to God or should we listen to you? Now, in their minds, they thought, well, we are God. What do you mean? We speak for God. They were dead wrong. But that's where they left it. Because you be the judge. And now they've seen, they've kept on preaching Jesus. And notice, to what extent does Jerusalem look in their eyes? What's it filled with? These 12 men have preached so much in Jerusalem that this teaching has filled the whole city. Right? These 12 uneducated, untrained men. And now look at what's happened. By the power of God. Not within their own power. So many times we look and say, well, I have this gift or I have that ability. You go, you better look at God. He's the giver. He's the one who gets the glory too. So, here they are. We gave you strict orders. Almost like, there's no way you didn't hear us. You almost might feel like a parent talking to a child. But this is much bigger. He says, to not continue in this name, yet you have filled Jerusalem with your teaching and intend to bring this man's blood upon us. They are so ignorant. They don't realize his blood's already all over their hands. Lois. They certainly did. Read through Matthew 27, 26, 27. They talked about it. He said, let his blood be on us and on our children. And you go, ooh. Now they don't want. Now, if you notice it here, I want you to look back at Matthew chapter 10. I want you to see that Jesus prepared them for this. Matthew chapter 10, look at verse 16. Now this is the first part of chapter 10. These first 15 verses are really about Jesus preparing the 12 to be sent out for the first time to preach about him. They've been given the authority over diseases and sicknesses and even spirits. But look at verse 16. He says, behold, I send you out as sheep in the midst of wolves. So be shrewd as serpents and innocent as doves. What's the situation? Bad situation, going to be dangerous. He says, look, he says, you got a bunch of wolves around you. He says, and you're going to be sheep. Let's see, what's the big fighting power that sheep have? I mean, at best, you could say that the males have battering rams for horns. Other than that, nothing. So who are these sheep going to have to rely on? Shepherd. Jesus the shepherd. Now, he says, I send you out as sheep in the midst of wolves, so be shrewd as serpents, be wise. He says, and innocent as doves, don't sin. Do what's right, but be wise. Verse 17, but beware of men. He says, for they will hand you over to the courts and scourge you in their synagogues. What kind of difficulty are we talking about here? Can you expect to be arrested? Can you expect to be scourged by the Jews? Yeah. He says, and you will even be brought before governors and kings for my sake, as a testimony to them and to the Gentiles. He says, you're going to stand before some great men who have earthly authority. Governors, Pilate, Herod. Start thinking down those lines. Then he even makes statement, kings. And actually, Herod's referred to as a king at one time. Then, verse 19. But when they hand you over, do not worry about how or what you are to say. For it will be given to you in that hour what you are to say. He says, for it is not you who speak, but it is the Spirit of your Father who speaks in you. If you think about being in their situation, here they are in the midst of the Sanhedrin. I mean, all eyes are on them. And all ears are attentive to a point. Not like they're really going to take in what they say, but they're listening. Would you be concerned about what you were going to say? Not if you remember the words of Jesus. Now, we know that they did, because that was a prophecy that Jesus told them, a fulfillment, a promise that was given, that they would remember all that Jesus said, they'd be led into all truth, and to go, they had that. If they weren't thinking about the words of Jesus, you'd come to this situation, and you might be afraid. You might have fear. But what had you prayed for? Give us all confidence. Give us boldness to preach you, even when standing to opposition. And to go, here they are. You get into this situation now. What's it like when you know what God has promised? You know what Jesus promised you. I don't have to worry about saying the right words. I don't have to worry about, can I remember which prophet it was that made these statements? They don't have to go down that road, because God gave them a helper, the Comforter, the Holy Spirit of God. And now to be able to stand up and go, we don't have to think about it. We don't have to go, is it time to be clever? Is it time to be straightforward in a very, very in-your-face way? Going, oh, here we are. Because you know whenever they're getting out of prison, that's not one, especially when they go to stand in the temple. You think they could foreshadow a little bit about what was coming? It's not like the jealousy of the Sadducees and the chief priests and the high priest all of a sudden just goes away. So now here's what's left right in front of them. And I'm just going to leave you hanging right here. And you've already read the chapter, so you know what's going on. But to see, when you start looking at difficulties in light of faith, it completely changes the situation. But if they came to this with no faith, which you'll find they had all kinds of faith, what about us? Whenever we meet the difficulties of life and we don't have any faith in the promises of God, what do you always find in the situation? Be easier or more difficult? More difficult. When you meet the difficulty with faith in the promises of God, not a blind faith. We're talking about promises that Jesus made, that the apostles gave. When you meet life knowing those promises are yours and that He'll keep His word, does it not change the situation drastically? We need to remember that too. That's probably our best part. Karen. Right. Doesn't stop them, knowing about this physical difficulty that's coming their way. Judy. You think in terms of being shrewd and yet being sinless? Jesus. That's really the only one you have to be knowledgeable about, because it deciphers light and dark, and it teaches you everything you need to know and to hold to Him. All right. Kept you over? Look at there. Sorry.